Good morning, everyone. Teresa is just going to run a quick presentation for us with some material on upcoming tours by Larsha. And in the meantime, Carl is going to get ready for his presentation. So we'll give it a minute or two while people are still joining, and then we'll do an introduction for Carl and get going. Carl, can I just get an indication? Are you there and do you have your presentation ready?
Yes, I am, and I
Okay.
do.
I think we've got lots of people in the room, so maybe we can carry on. I just wanted to do a quick introduction. Morning, everyone. My name is Helene Krause. Thanks for joining our, I think it's the second web chat for the year so far. I'd like to introduce to you Carl Steyn, if you don't already know him. Carl's an expert in contaminated land, waste management, and site closure, and he specializes in geochemistry, data science, and environmental risk assessment. He's got a wealth of experience, so over 30 years, and I've had the privilege of working with Cole. He's an excellent mentor and a very collaborative problem solver. And you know what I admire the most about him is that he's always up for a good debate about just about anything. So I've learned with Cole that, there's no such thing as a quick question, and that's because there's no such thing as a silly or an easy question. Um, he deeply appreciates the complexity and the uncertainty that are inherent to everyday things. So, Cole, it's such an honor to have you here today to talk to us about mastering uncertainty and how to make good decisions in an uncertain world. It's all about environmental compliance that's under growing legal and reputational pressure, and how the decisions that we make with uncertainty due to data gaps, variability, and overconfidence bias all influence that. So he's going to talk about approaches for improving that. So I'm going to hand over Cole to start the presentation. You are welcome to drop your questions in the chat box, but we are going to just keep them until the end, and then we can take questions. Thank you very much. Thanks, Cole.
I don't see a share button. uh, Oh, here we are. Got it. Sorry. Can you guys see my presentation?
Yes, all good. I think just make it full screen mode.
Yeah, I'm trying. There's just now the whole thing is in my way. Let me just, here we are. Cool. Can you guys see that? Can everybody see that that it's full screen?
Yes, it's looking good. I think you're good to go.
Okay, great. I'm not going to see hands or anything because I'm looking at the presentation. So just like, I don't know, say or whatever, and stop me if you want to discuss something. It's a bit of a discussion. It's not it's more conceptual maybe than it will be maybe detailed things. And the whole, obviously, as a consultant and as a scientist, the question of making good decisions is important to us. And I've always found that very difficult because of the amount of uncertainty that there's. And during 2020 and COVID, we're stuck in the house. And Anthony Botha and I, who also works at the Greenco, started chatting just over Skype and that, and throwing around ideas about like products and all kinds of things. And at that time, I also decided to do a course on Bayesian statistics as well, because I was always interested in that. And I went through the course, and I came to this sort of shocking realization that maybe I was looking at the whole thing wrong, and times have changed. And I'll go through why I think times have changed, and we can approach it a little bit differently. Now, as scientists, I think we inherently follow this approach, although we don't explicitly follow this approach. So maybe let me start. The quote that I want to sort of use as the background to the whole thing is this one by Laplace in 1812. So the idea around this is not new. The whole way of thinking or the approach to making decisions is not new. In 1812, Laplace was the guy that really made this mathematically possible. Now that's more than 200 years ago. But even Cicero before Christ had ideas around this. So in the Roman time. So this isn't new. But I think what he says here is pretty important. So he says the most important questions in life are, for the most part, really only problems of probability. Strictly speaking, one may even say that nearly all our knowledge is problematical, and is a small number of things which we are able to know with certainty. Even in mathematical science themselves, induction and analogy, the principal means for discovering truth are based on probabilities. And I think that's the sort of key message I want to give. And now the question around that is, how do we all know this. We know, like, if you're an environmental scientist, there's like a lot of variability in our science. So when you start thinking about it, I mean, everything goes about probability. That all sounds logical to everybody. But the problem is that we haven't been empowered through maybe just a sort of consequence of history to be able to integrate this in our decisions every day. And I want to just like explore a couple ideas. And if you guys want to interrupt me and ask and chat about some stuff, let's do that. So the first thing I want to do to sort of say why the time is now right to be able to integrate this better into our science is I want to just go through the history a little bit. So one of the first people that wrote a paper about it in 1763 is a minister and a statistician, Thomas Bayes. And he developed the theory of the Bayesian statistics. So now I'm talking about probabilities, but now I'm calling things like Bayesian. So the name of the stats is named after him because he's the first person that sort of wrote the theory down. Bayesian statistics is sort of the statistical methodology in which we can take the way of thinking into numbers. But the concept and the way of thinking about probabilities was originated really in that paper. Well, not originated in the paper, but was written down in that paper first. Laplace was the first person who sort of made it more mathematical. So he got formulas for integration, because the problem is, and you'll see why it becomes logical, why it's now a lot more possible than in the history. Previously, if you wanted to do random or probabilistic things, you needed some kind of way of integrating those things. So the calculus and all of that stuff became really important. And that's pretty difficult to simulate stuff that is uncertain into a formula of some kind. And the maths behind it becomes pretty difficult and difficult to execute. Then there was some geophysicists that played an important role, but then people that you might know that has played an important role is Alan Turing. Most of you have probably seen the Enigma code. And that was pretty interesting how he executed. In the movie, they don't talk about it much. They talk about the computer they built for it. But the science behind it is this science of probability of a word. And the error that was made in the Enigma machine was that they made it that no repeat letters could be given out in the translation of the code. So there was no, say, double T's or any double numbers. And because of that, they could work out, because in real language, there is often double O's, double E's, double T's, double L's. There's a lot of double letters in real language. And they could work it out by probability, what the probability of certain words are. And once they've got that, then they can just work it back. And they could do that reasonably quickly. Another guy that was a super important part of this is the whole Monte Carlo computational method. And that's the key of the modern day ability to execute it with computing power. And he did this during the Manhattan Project when they built the nuclear bomb. So luckily something good came out of that. Stanislav Ulam was a Polish mathematician and a statistician, and he developed this Monte Carlo method, and because they at that time had the first rudimentary computers, he was able to use that methodology. And then Janus, he started the sort of advocacy for actually making this thing happen. Now, previously, like I'm saying, the stats is different, or the way of making it numerical is different. So the previous sort of way, and that's the way I was taught right through 80s, 90s, early 2000s, is the frequentist method. And I'll show you how that differs slightly. Conceptually, it's, for me, even hard to get it sometimes. But it's just the approach to data and information that differs slightly. And because of that, there's a fundamental shift in the way that you would do the statistics, but also in the way that you think about what is good information to base your decision on. Okay, so the two things that are really made this whole thing able to be done in modern day to make decisions numerical and make it into a numerical decision is computing power. So and the development of this Stanislav Ulam's development of Monte Carlo, and then the advancements that have come past that, there's many iterations, and Makarov chain Monte Carlo is it. And essentially Monte Carlo sounds like a pretty big thing, and it's just, apparently he was always speaking about his uncle gambling, and so when he developed this thing, they called it Monte Carlo. So it's really a thing to work on probabilities, and all it does is it selects out of a predetermined distribution a number of iterations of the possible problem, and then you get the distribution. Where previously you had to use calculus for that, and it never really presented the reality, or because you had to select some kind of calculus formula. Well, now you could run multiple simulations and put it together. So Monte Carlo, although it sounds like all grand and whatever, it's just a repeated calculation with different parameters. You could just call it that. And then now there's so many modern applications that have been published in every field possible that you can think. And the big thing that I want to bring in here is our ability to incorporate prior knowledge and not an over-reliance on data. Now, I'm a data scientist, so I love data, but we have come, because of the training that we've had, we've come to say, the data that you have, you say you evaluate that data, and what the data says is truth. However, the data is imperfect. too little. There's a lot of problems. And when you come into the environmental science, even more than these other fields that I've put down here, we don't have data. So if you think about the whole society nowadays is big machine learning, big data, all of these things, all of that predisposes or thinks about big data. So in our field, environmental science, we often have very little data. We can only put in a few balls. We can only collect some samples. Our spatial distributions are poor. There's a whole lot of constraints, and especially when you come into consulting or, you're spending a company's money to try and figure out something, it's really difficult to get sufficient data. And so even in our field, it's even more important to follow this type of approach rather than just looking at the data. Now, as consultants, we often inherently already do that. We see the data, we know it's too little, but we still have to make a decision. So we are actually following a Bayesian process inherently in our decision making. However, we're not explicitly enumerating that. And this is a tool that we can do to explicitly enumerate it. Yeah, so that's a little bit of background, and here's some so while Anthony and I were chatting, he picked up this Fooled by Randomness, the book Fooled by Randomness. I think you heard it on a podcast. What's the guy's name? Anyhow, I can't remember the guy's name now. But in any case, Nicholas Taleb wrote, this is the sort of theoretical background. So if you want to read something that will give you the sort of conceptual understanding behind it, the Fooled by Randomness, number one, they actually follow in each other, and the Black Swan idea and anti-fragility and skin in the game and all that goes about risk and how do we execute risk and how to understand risk in a different concept. So this is really good reading if you're interested in that. I would start there, just the book Fooled by Randomness, or the podcast, or the audio book, or whatever. That would be really great. And then there's a free course, and this is the course I did in 2020, and he updates this, and it's free on the internet, depending on where he's teaching in the world, in Germany, in, I think, Sweden, in wherever. He then puts this course.
Sorry,
hello. Can you hear me?
It's just someone's mic that's unmuted. Sorry,
Cole. I thought somebody wanted to ask a question quickly. So this is a good course if you in.
Can I just ask, are you sharing a screen, because I can't see it?
Oh, that sucks.
Okay. Am I the only one?
Anybody else?
No, we can see. Thank you.
Can you see the resources tab?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I can see.
No.
We can see.
No, I'll see if I can fiddle
No,
around.
I can see Yvonne.
There's something wrong with my computer. Okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, so this is if you're interested in to take the idea. Look, I believe the principle, the way of thinking can be incorporated into any decision you need to make in your private life, into our consulting or science. But in his, he gives it's like an introductory thing into how to go from this thinking into numerical numbers, into data, into evaluating your data. So that's a really good kickoff course. And from there, they give a whole lot of other reading that you can do, and then you can just go into the rabbit hole and disappear for a couple of days. Yeah, lots of fun. Okay. So the quote that I started off was the important questions in life. And if you think about it, in the environmental sciences, in rehab, in contaminated land and that, we are really talking about the important questions of life. In terms of the future that we will have. And I mean, we're becoming increasingly more aware about how precarious we are poised in the world in terms of our environmental situation. I mean, one doesn't want to be a doomsday, but there is a lot of questions that we need to get answered and need to get it answered scientifically and get them answered well. And the thing that it goes about is the idea that, so most of these initial ideas or conceptual ideas that I've picked out of the work of Taleb and others, of course, that I think is very applicable to environmental science. And the first idea is the risk of ruin problems. So Taleb calls it problems like climate change or a potential risk of ruin problems. It's like the outcome of that risk has a non-zero probability of resulting in an unrecoverable loss. In other words, if this happens, we're not going to be able to recover that. And many questions that we talk about, like contamination, if there was a widespread contamination of something, people could die, you can't reverse that. It's done. So there's a lot of risk of ruin problems. So when you're talking, and now you can see I've already started bringing in the word risk into the idea. So the probability, the whole concept of probabilities or uncertainty is semantically the same as risk. You can't separate those things, uncertainty, probability. So in actual fact, when we're talking about making a decision, we are actually talking about the risk of getting that decision wrong or the risk that we are trying to say something about. So risk, uncertainty, probability is all part of the same discussion. So you'll see the word risk start popping out now in the presentation, but you must also think about risk is really also just a question of probabilities. Okay, so but a risk of ruin problems, those are really important problems to solve. And they require more rigor than other applications in statistical inference. And that's why I think in the environmental space, and if I put that list, the previous list that I had about the sciences, it's been used in other sciences like standardly. But I've found in environmental science where, to me, it might even be of a higher order risk of ruin type decisions we're making, we just aren't doing that. And I am saying we need to start developing the habits within the science that we live in to be more rigorous about these risk decisions or about uncertainty decision. Yeah, and the policies we make must be based on this uncertainty concerning the adverse consequence and not only on the known effects. And I'll come to the known effects part a little bit. The next part about the environment that I think is super important and why this probabilistic approach to thinking is super important to get into our heads is the complexity of systems. So as soon as you get a complex system, your variability goes up or your uncertainty increases. And complex systems, if you push them too far, won't come back. So a complex system has this sort of uneasy network of things that are integrated and complex, not complicated, but complex. And if you were to break one of those cycles, it's the whole ecological idea, then that whole system can't come back. And so nature is very much so, and that also makes it more important to do. The complex system with many unknowns, harm is typically in the dose and not only in the nature of the system, increasing non-linearity to the level of making them fragile systems. So we are working with very fragile systems because of the complexity of those systems. And that also increases the uncertainty with which we want to make a decision. Yeah. while some contamination is inevitable, high quantities of any contaminant results in an exponential increase of the disability, destabilizing the system. So in other words, when we say, okay, but this level is okay, it's actually not how these complex systems work. It's actually not a linear thing, like at this point it's okay, below this is okay, above that is okay. There's an exponential increase as you go higher in certain levels or certain impacts or certain effects that increase your risk exponentially as you go higher. And not just at this level or this thing there's risk, and below it there's not risk. So that's also an important thing to understand. And then we come to the sort of discussion of uncertainty. And so, I mean, it's implicit in every environmental decision, although we rarely explicitly express or even less quantify that uncertainty. So when you see a report or consultant report and you come to the conclusions or the exact sum or whatever, people would just make statements like it is contaminated, or it's holding risk, or it's going to do this, or this is going to happen, or the model says this will happen. But actually, in that decision, there's a massive uncertainty and a propensity to risk, but we don't express this, and we even less put this in numbers. And the next part is when we typically talk about uncertainty, probability, we typically think about randomness. There's now grand words that they use as aleatory, but it's really the randomness. Now, we all know that. If you take a soil sample on one place and you work a meter away, you're going to get a different analysis. And there's some kind of randomness in that. There's even, error in the analysis. Like if you get a less than 10% analytical, or, that's probably good. Maybe if you're looking at biological systems and plants, 20% variability is okay. So we all know this, and that's what we often think about uncertainty we think about this randomness, but there's another part of uncertainty is just our pure lack of knowledge. We just don't know everything. There's often, when you come to a site, there's a lot of unknowns, and these things, in terms of solving uncertainty, must be treated differently. With randomness, you can you can just do more sampling, and that's often our default. We just do more sampling, we continue doing more sampling, but we can't reduce the uncertainty because we're not doing studies that are increasing our knowledge. So often you'll see like recommendations and stuff are all just about collecting more samples. But what we should be doing is studies to solve the uncertainty that's related to the question that needs to be asked. So that's another thing that we often, I think we need to think about is the gaining knowledge part. And this is where universities and that play a really important role, but they are often marginalized in big decisions that are done practically every day on site. So not always, but I think that sort of knowledge building part of it also needs to be sort of recommended and understood when we're making recommendations about solving a certain problem. Okay, so if you think about all of that, it boils down to risk. And there's a couple of things that philosophically that sort of underpins a lot of these ideas about making good decisions. Is that the first is experts' conclusions are generally overconfident and underestimate risk. So I've been working in the field for 30 years. I think I know. And I say, okay, cool. This is how it works. I've got these rules of thumb in my head. I don't investigate further because it takes brain power. I've thought this through. I've never seen this thing happen. So why would it happen? So I underestimate what the risk is. But the fact is, I've only lived 50 years. I haven't seen it happen, but it's not unplausible that it could happen. But because I haven't seen it, as an expert, you feel confident that it won't happen. You've got this bias in your head, and because you've studied this, you feel you know stuff, so you are generally confident and underestimate risk, or underestimate the uncertainty that's related to the decision that you're writing down in the conclusions or abstract or whatever. And we as experts are better at narrating what we know than what we don't know. And this goes back to saying that we need to look at knowledge developing stuff as well. So we're better at saying, okay, well, we know these things, but we're not really good at saying, okay, but these are the knowledge gaps we have, the uncertainty we have in making a decision. We often say we follow a risk-based approach. But we actually don't quantify. We say that we follow a risk-based approach, but we just haven't quantified. So the risk-based approach is, we follow a source pathway receptor approach to contaminated land. Hello? Somebody's asked something. Okay, so we say we follow a risk-based approach, but actually what we're doing is we just say using thresholds. We're not saying what the likelihood of occurrence is and the uncertainties in the consequences, but we say we follow a risk-based approach. So a source pathway receptor approach isn't a risk-based approach, and people can argue with me about that, and there is some argument to make, but that's the sort of standard. Everybody thinks, okay, if you evaluate the sources and the pathways and the receptors, and if those are connected, you have a risk or you don't have a risk. However, a risk-based approach goes about the likelihood or the uncertainty of that and the consequence of that. And that never really gets numerated. It's all just standard thresholds. So we don't really follow a risk-based approach. We're just following a methodology or a sequence of decision-making. So, and when you look at the ISO definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So that can be positive or negative. So if you want to make a decision that might make you money or might do something, what's the risk of that not happening? That's also risk. It's the objective being achieved, the risk of not achieving that objective. It can be positive or negative. So yeah, and must be implicit in the, so uncertainty is implicit in the decision of risk. We as people are poor judges of probability and risk. The reason being, if we had to live looking at risk the whole time, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. You wouldn't drive a car because that's one of the highest risk activities that you will take. You wouldn't do a whole lot of things, and everybody that does these extreme sports and things, they just completely ignore risk. So or really work hard at mitigating risk when they do it. So it becomes important to try and standardize some kind of methodology, terminology around risk and risk estimation, or making good decisions, good and bad. Any decision has a risk of not being correct when you are making them. So even though this has a very long history from before Christ, it's only now that we have been able to get the numerical tools because of computing power to be able to start doing this. However, most of the people working in this field have still been taught in a world where this wasn't possible. And we're in this transition time. And what I'm proposing is that we should start thinking and getting a new language of decision making and a new sort of subtle shift in the way that we are thinking. A lot of it's already done, but just not explicitly done. So So coming to the approach. So theoretically, there's a lot of things to think about, and will be even if you're not a mathematical or statistical or whatever, just the approach to the thinking of making decisions under uncertainty, so like reading Fooled by Randomness and those type of things, will help you make better decisions in your life and in when you're doing environmental science. But inevitably, if you you need to sort of get something mathematical down to start making better decisions. Yeah, so in the case of ruin, like our risk of ruin, by the time we get evidence of that experience, it will be too late. So the risk of ruin idea is often the outlier, the 1 in 200-year flood, the 1 in 1,000-year flood. They are possible, but never observed. So we tend to just ignore them. So what we need to start in making our decisions, determine what are those outliers, those far off or potentially low possibility events, but also look at if they are risk of ruin events that could possibly happen. And if they are risk of ruin events, we need to clearly think about what our approach to those outliers will be. Is it then good enough to say we will ignore a 1 in 200-year flood and go for a 1 in 100-year design? And that opens another debate, but being that may, if you look at the risk of ruin potential for climate change, for example, is it good enough to say, but we don't have enough information, so we just don't do anything about it? Yeah, that's also a debate. Yeah, so most events that are going to, if you're doing environmental decision, most of the events that will occur that is going to cause us trouble will be outlier events or extreme events. They are not the average, and they are not the central tendency. They're not the medians. However, we've been taught to work on median, mean, modes, any of those central theorem type ideas or central tendency estimations. Yeah, so if the average is this, or, in some cases, people might say we use a conservative approach, we're going to do the 95th percentile or whatever. But they're not, even if you use the 95th percentile, you're not looking at the long tail that could be in the 2 or 3% and what the consequence of those events might be. So even then, we are not really, by selecting a number and not considering the full distribution of potential effects, you are opening yourself for making decisions that in the long term aren't the best decision. So our historic sort of focus on getting central tendencies, normal statistical approaches like the normal distribution, just variability, but even variability in our science is really difficult because we often have too few samples to make decisions from. So risk is something in future that might not have happened and should be expressed in probabilities and is relative and not absolute. So, yeah. And one of the things I think we need to start thinking as scientists is like, this is something that's often said when you're getting taught, but the consequence of that is the absence of evidence does not equate to the evidence of absence. But we sort of, when we're making decisions, we seem to do that by default. And we need to be a bit aware of it. And if you're following a probabilistic approach, you become more aware of that idea. Yeah, so we've got better statistical models and different ways of looking at the outlier possibilities. Monte Carlo simulations that have randomness built into it. So if you want to do that, you need a little bit of coding language. But what we should develop is a common language of probability rather than predictions. So instead of saying this is what's going to happen, we say this is the likelihood that that will happen. And even though you might not do statistics, your thinking can be down that line. And we need to adjust to the existence of risk. So because we as people are, we say we're risk adverse, but we actually aren't. We are typically able to ignore quite big risks and live with that until it happens with you. And because of that, we have to start getting the understanding in our heads of the existence of risk. And we must start focusing on what we don't know and what can happen, but we don't know. So take 9/11, for example. Before 9/11 actually happened, there were people that were advocating in government in the US and worldwide for stricter security things, because there were books written, storybooks and things written about events similar to what happened in 9/11. And there were people, but because it has never happened, or foreseeably, like, people couldn't imagine it happening, these guys just never got traction. So they didn't have the power, and everybody just, nah, and never happened. The day after it happened, draconian measures were implemented. Never mind the ones that were proposed that would have protected things, even more extreme things, because now it has actually happened. And that's really a good example of, now that might sound extreme, but in our environmental things, we do the same thing. We're often saying that this extreme event is very unlikely to happen, but we're not really considering the consequence properly. We should not only learn the facts, but the rules to follow. So we must use our understanding of how the environment works and not just the data that's right on the table. We should be looking at processes and possibilities of things occurring. And we should develop systems that identify extreme events so we can prepare for them. Okay. So just some, and I'm going to come to some examples now. So we need to come to a common acceptance and understanding of the language of uncertainty. So if we start all understanding the whole thing around uncertainty better, we will be able to start integrating it better, because we'll have a better understanding around that thing. So it's not just variability, it also goes about the lack of knowledge, which I've actually preempted already in the previous discussion. And here's an example for you. So the frequentist idea, okay, so there are many misconceptions and around what the stats say and what probabilities are and what uncertainties are. And one of them is this whole focused of a frequentist idea of a mean, median, mode, or central value. And it comes out into something like a p-value. Significance, when you're talking about a p-value, is the probability of your result, the data. Forget about what you know before the time, just your data. Will occur or won't occur by chance. So it's only considering randomness, it's only considering the data, and then they say, okay, we want a 5% certainty that it will or won't happen, or a 1% certainty that it will or whatever. We put a value on that. However, what would be better is not to look at what defines the median, and if the next one's median is more than the previous one's median of the data, it's better to define the whole population of values that might occur. So these possible occurrences of something is actually a whole distribution, not just the mean and the area around the mean that gives the certainty value. It's the whole confidence interval. So we should rather start talking about confidence intervals and the probability that the true value of a point estimate, such as the mean, will fall into it. Yeah, so we should be looking at the whole distribution and not just the values of what defines the mean. Yeah, so we need to, maybe the next slide is going to present that a little bit better. So what we should start talking about is just two definitions. The first one is a confidence interval. Should be replaced by words like the highest density or equal-tailed credible interval. So if you look at the top two, that sort of defines what that is. It's saying this is the interval in which any possible occurrence of that event or contamination or erosion or whatever may occur will be between these intervals. And instead of saying what the percentage possibility of defining the mean is. And the same with when you're trying to see if something is equivalent to something else, instead of saying, oh, the mean differs by a p-value of X or A, we are saying that the region, we can use words like the region of practical equivalence. So in this little graph, you see the darker orange piece and the red piece. The red piece falls in the region of practical equivalence and foreseeably could be the same, but their means might differ and the p-value might differ, but in actual fact, they aren't different. And the opposite can also occur. Okay, so that, like, just start changing our words to confidence intervals and regions of practical equivalence. And then what we've also seen, and we all know that, is most natural systems often are, because of the complexity of the systems, are exponential or scalable or have fat tails. Like a log scale is a pretty standard way of looking at a distribution, is a log normal scale. That has a reasonably fat tail. But in actual fact, many environmental things are power law distributions, not just log normally distributed. They are exponents large, and I'll show you one or two examples now. So when we're looking at risk, often we shouldn't just look at log normally distributed things. We should look at things that have even bigger tails, like the Pareto, Cauchy, whatever distributions. And that's for people that want to go into more detail about exactly which ones they are. But selecting the right distribution when you're doing the numerical thing and not just slapping on the log normal distribution is an important concept to start thinking about. Okay, so here's a couple of examples that I've done in my work. And the one is a region of, region of practical equivalence. So in this case, what I did is I defined the region of practical equivalence for something to its background. So these are the background concentrations or regions of practical equivalence for a background value. And they're not just based on data, because often you only have one or two background samples, but also on other work, studies, MSCs, PhDs, you can define a region of practical equivalence. And if the sample that you are taking is within that range, the possibility exists that it's actually a background value and not higher than the background. So often a mistake that's made is people take samples in a contaminated area and then take one sample outside that area. They don't match it even for the same soil type or whatever. They just take a sample outside the area. And then they say, oh, but these values are higher or lower than that value, and therefore they are either below or above background. But actually what we should be looking at is the region of practical equivalence. So that's one way of using it. The next one is when you're looking at population exceedances. So here's a waste classification I did using this. So we had a very variable waste facility. And so now the question changes is like I could have used the highest value of a sample that was taken, but that highest value might not even fall in the area of possible values given the material that was disposed in that area. Because I can take 10 samples. In this case, I actually took something like 15 samples, which is quite a lot for a waste classification. Often they only allow us to take one sample. So if you're only going to work on the data and you make a waste classification based on that, you are probably going to be wrong in your classification because you just don't know where that sample was taken. What you should be doing is looking at the properties, and in a waste situation, there's a lot of information because it comes out of an industry that the scientists that develop that process and extraction know often what the values are in those things. So you have prior knowledge that you can use to make a distribution of possible values. So if you had to go back to that sample and sample a random sample, this graph will give you the chance of that sample falling within that range and the probability of that occurring. And you can see in this waste facility, it's stretched mainly over 3 different classes of waste. So there is a chance that it could even be a hazardous waste above it. The level 3, I think it's a LCT 3 level. There's a 26% chance that it's in a level 2, and a 29 in a level 1, and a 44% chance in level 2. So if you're trying to classify this waste, what do you classify it? Now you need to go and look at risk, and what's the chance of that risk causing some kind of risk of ruin event. And then you can make a decision, how risk adverse are you going to be for classifying this? So if you look at the mean, it actually falls in the between L1 and L2. And the region of practical equivalence, there's this bar at the bottom, gives you an idea maybe how to make the decision. It makes the decision slightly harder, but you at least know what you know and what you don't know. And then you can do your, and then it's also open. Everybody knows what your classification is based on. It's just not just one sample and a value that you've taken. And this includes prior knowledge. Another one that I used it in is in frequency modeling to look at what I believe would precipitate. And again, there's a lot of variability. You only have certain groundwater samples that you can take to make a decision. And based on Monte Carlo simulations, you can see what the likelihood of a certain event being occurred in another one. And you can also do it in modeling. So the graph on the right at the bottom is the probability of different ratios of discard and waste rock, and the likelihood of that being acidic. So at lower ratios of discard to waste rock, because of the neutralizing capacity of the waste rock, has between a 67 to nearly 70% chance of not being acidic. But as soon as you get above a certain ratio of about, what's that, 20% discard, 20 to 30% discard, your likelihood of it being acidic is going to have acidic leachate is going to be super high. And so that helps you then, based on this type of modeling, probabilistic modeling, to make a better prediction of, instead of saying, well, it's going to be acidic because the discard is acidic, you can go and look at these type of ratios. Here's another one, and this one explains the distributions to be used better. So in developing a waste facility, One of the problems they have is that the aggregate below the liner can puncture the liner if the weight on the liner is too heavy. So the department asked that a decision be made, and the team did 2 lead plates. So what they did is they applied the weight onto a test for a site with the aggregate and the liner that was used, and they get a lead plate that looks at the strain of in the plastic and what's the chance of there being a breakthrough. So now the question is that lead plate that we've only got 2 lead plates, but what's the chance of there being a hole? In this lead plate, there's not one of those that actually created a hole. But if you look at the distribution of possible outcomes based on the ones that you did observe, there is some possibility of there being a hole of a certain type. And then you can use theories like the volume versus the surface area of a stone or of any thing is the square cube law. So the normal distribution is this green line. It's a log normal distribution will be the green line, but the tails are actually much longer if you're using the exponential square cubed law. And therefore, there is a chance, and then you can calculate using that theoretical knowledge, you can calculate the odds of the threshold of 0.2 stretch being exceeded is what, 3%? Yeah, 3%. 0.2%, sorry. Yeah, and then so you can make a much better informed decision, and then you can actually calculate that how many holes per area that could have been, and not just the data that you got from the 2 lead plates. So that's the sort of thinking that you can use. Other one that's for the closure people that might be interesting is probabilistic closure costing. So we know closure costing is for future. Super uncertain. There's like 20 years before the time, you're not even certain what methodology of rehab you're often going to use. You don't know what water treatment process you're going to use. You don't know what capping, what all of these uncertainties are there, but we give a value. And even worse, we give a rate that in some cases, I think the one thing we calculate that a 10 cents difference in one of the rates, 10 cents difference in one of the rates caused like a 300, I think it was 300,000 Rand difference in the value. And often rates, the uncertainty around a rate could be like 10 Rand, never mind 10 cents. So it could be millions just based on the rate that you choose. So given that uncertainty, what is the value of a closure costing? And the pressures on a closure costing, everybody's got a different objective in getting to a closure costing. The company, the mine wants the lowest value. The consultants wants to mitigate these risks. He wants the highest value. But in actual fact, we are all talking about the same thing. We're just looking at different ends of the distribution of the costs. And isn't it better to be able to make decisions about where that uncertainty lies if you enumerated each of the uncertainties in the quantity and the rate, and then the sum of those two being the total? And this is where a Monte Carlo simulation really comes in. And then you get a distribution, and then you can start saying, is like in the top right-hand corner, we are that a certain value will be exceeded or not exceeded. So if you have a closure liability that you're putting away a certain amount, how likely is it that you are going to exceed that value? So in the graph on the right, in 2016, that value, which is the same from 2016, 17, 18, 19, the vertical dotted line, there is a much lower chance in 2016, not changing the rate. The value is the same. The closure costing quantum that you've given is the same. But in 2020, it's a lot more likely, 50-50 chance that you're going to exceed that value. While in 2016, it's a much lower percentage of chance that you're going to exceed that value. And so then you know, and you can also then define which one of these distributions are the most uncertain. And then you can go back, is that uncertainty due to not understanding the variability, which for that the study would be to sample more and maybe get the timeline sampling right. But if you are uncertain about something that you just don't know, to go and do studies to define that lack of knowledge better. Like go and do a study that will say which is the best method to use, or the best, or whatever that you want to closure option that you want to use. So that's another example where it can be used numerically. Okay. So maybe I want to open for discussions. I've got a couple of things for your thoughts, but always remember, if you're thinking probabilistically, and this is where I think COVID, the people don't think the scientific way of thinking often, but always remember I may be wrong. Like I can be wrong. If you don't believe that, then you can't think probabilistically, because then we are overconfident and we're making decisions that are overconfident. More data information I get in future, and that's the AI idea. So I think this now, but if I get more, and that's the whole Bayesian process, which is used in AI, the Bayesian process used in our cell phones, in a whole lot of places that we just don't even realize it's being used in. And just to think in environmental science that we are doing, I think our importance escalate, the importance of our decisions escalate. And the reasons we should do it is not for us, but for those who are to come. I was born when this school started, and I went to school at Settlers Agricultural High, and the headmaster at that time for more than 30 years was Mr. Bill Akerson. This is the school motto, and this is what made one of the sort of things that made me go into environmental science. And I think we must look at the importance of the decisions we make and put in sufficient diligence in making our decisions. Thanks.
Thank you, Cole. That was excellent. So we're going to take some questions now. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We've unmuted or not unmute. You are able to unmute yourself if you have a question.
I'll have to stop sharing, or maybe I can.
Yes, I think do that, because then you'll be able to see. There are questions in the chat as well.
Are you seeing my presentation still, or now the?
Yes, I'm still seeing your presentation.
Ah, cool. All right, then I've found a way of looking at everybody without questions in the chat. Ish. Okay, let's see. That's a good one. Giving one enough rope to hang themselves. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's conceptually for us as people really difficult to think on a low probability of something happening. But if something has a low probability of happening and has a very low risk of ruin possibility, then it's sort of insignificant to even think about it. And we want to easily classify everything into that space, but we don't consider that some possible outlier events may really be a big problem. Yeah, that is. Yeah, so the evidence thing that's a really good comment, is it's if you just use the data, then you can say, well, this is what the data says. However, the data itself isn't certain. And the thing is, the fact that it does, anything we do doesn't take away the uncertainty. So that uncertainty remains there. The fact is, if you say, well, this is the thing, all it's done is hidden the uncertainty. Isn't it better to express the uncertainty explicitly in your conclusions and things, and then let everybody know what that uncertainty and difficulty in making the decision is, and what the probability of making the wrong decision is, so that when we make the decision, we all can make that decision together, rather than just trusting on somebody that might or might not have the right experience. Any other questions?
I don't see any hands raised. Maybe I'll ask a question. Cole, for as long as I've known you, you've been working on this. So to you, it's second nature, but I think to a lot of us, it's not. And now people are grappling with a problem like, oh dear, I've been doing it wrong. Where do I go from here? So what's your advice to this audience if they are scientists and they get to deal with data every day? How do you take that first step? Because you can't solve all of it from tomorrow onwards.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is you're actually doing that in your head every day when you're making a decision. So you're coming out, you want to get dressed. Is it cold or is it hot? You look out the window, you make a decision. Oh, it's 50-50. Oh, wait, no, it's not 50-50. It's summer. So it's going to be hot. It's not winter. Okay. So now it's hot. How hot is it going to be? You look out the window, see no clouds, no wind. Oh, shucks, that's going to be really hot today. So you can, as you get information, so you're doing this automatically in your head the whole time. You're making decisions. The thing that I'm saying is to make it express these things into numbers and on paper and say them aloud, how you are making that decision, rather than hiding that in your opinion and writing that down on a piece of paper. So what we often do is we make an overconfident decision and then just say to the client, this is what you should do. But actual fact, I have a lot of misgivings about that maybe. I'm like, yeah, this is the thing to do, but I'm actually 50-50 on this. But I have to tell him something, so I tell him something. And that's the thing, that just to explicitly say what's going on in your head. So you're already doing that Bayesian thing. You know some stuff, and then you see the data and you say, oh, given this is probably the best answer. And that's Bayesian thinking. Instead of saying, well, let me ignore everything that I know, I'm just going to look at the data. Nobody really does that. Although we express it that way in our reports, we often don't actually do that. We make an opinion that's based on stuff we already know. All I'm saying is we must do that explicitly. So it doesn't take away the uncertainty. So that's the first thing I want to say. We're already doing this. The only thing that I'm saying is to do it explicitly and to verbalize these things. When it comes to numerical stuff, yeah, I know it's like the numerical part of this way of thinking isn't for everybody. But the tools have been pretty simplified so that it can be done numerically quite easily, yeah, with a little bit of effort. And then I began with the resource page, and I think those two things, the one for people that just want the philosophy behind it, Taleb is the guy to just read about it, and from there you can go and read a lot of other philosophical things. But then if you want to get an introductory course, that one about McClerath is really one good one to start. He simplifies it reasonably well. So he's actually giving it to like a whole lot of group of different scientists. It's an introductory course. It gives a good, so I would start there. And that's why I did it there. It's just, it's not as complicated. We're doing it every day. We're just not explicitly writing down, and that's basically what I'm advocating.
Okay, that's a good approach. Thanks for that. We've also got a question from Piet van Deventer.
Yeah.
Piet, if you can unmute, go for it.
Hi, Ilian and Carl. I just want to elaborate a little bit more on your population exceedance graph.
Yeah.
And specifically when you are limited by your client, just to take one sample.
Yeah.
I know it's all about scale, but scale is also will be relevant to the final risk and the final cost of closure.
Yes.
So how do you overcome that problem of only one sample or limited sample?
So typically how we do it is you take a sample and then you take your knowledge of what you know, and then you try and make a decision that will help the client. And the more knowledge you have, the more experience you have, the better you're going to make that decision. However, we then say it's based on the data, but it's actually not based on the data often. It's just the decision. But now take soil science, for example. We know a lot about how different profiles go. So we got a lot of other information. We know how that profile looks. We know how it compares to other profiles that we've seen in the past. We know how if you look at the soil in that area and you've looked at the soil, even though you might only have one sample, you can say that's the whole land type idea. You can say, well, these few samples is representative of this whole area, given that these factors are similar in that area. And so you can make extrapolations based on what you know. And this method is actually just to do that, is to say, what do we know before the time? We know this is this type of soil type. We know that it's this thing. We know this, we know that. And before we even see the data, we can make with a reasonable distribution, what the probable situation of that will be. So if you go and look at a soil in a certain area, given the knowledge you have about land types and that, you can say, okay, we think this is going to be a high clay soil because we can see it's turf or whatever, or it's going to be a sandy soil because it comes on these Table Mountain sandstones or whatever. We know that before we've even started to take the sample. So all the sample does is to confirm or deny that. And you can then also use what you've observed when you've taken that sample. You might only take one sample, but you've observed 10 other profiles. And based on all that knowledge, you can say, but from what I see, this is what it's likely to be. And then you say, well, given this one data point, how does it adjust what I understand? And that's a much better sort of expression of what could be the case. And giving all the uncertainties you have than just taking that one sample. So that is a way of mitigating the fact that we often cannot take many samples. But we just need to express it more clearly, because you could get a sample that is way off. And then you say, well, this is what I thought before the time, but now this one's way off. Why is it way off? And then you can say, okay, is there a good reason for that? And then you can start looking at the data. And if there is no good reason, then it gets incorporated into that distribution. It doesn't ignore that whole distribution. It just makes that distribution that you previously thought less likely, given that one sample, or more likely if it actually fits the pattern.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl.
Yeah, so like anything we do doesn't take away the uncertainty that underlies or exists. The question is just how do we talk about it?
And how do we represent it in our reports?
And how we represent it. And I say it doesn't even have to be numerical. You can just do it in words.
Okay, I'm just checking if there's any other questions. Are we good? Anyone else who wants to take the floor? Nothing. They're blown away, Carl. I see your email addresses down there, so I think you're going to get lots of emails afterwards because people have to wrap their minds around it. It's almost like you're grappling with a thought, but you can't put it into a question because you don't understand the question just yet.
Yeah, so there's a bit of
So-
a philosophy behind it. So it's always good to like, yeah, grapple with it a little bit. But in actual fact, I think we're doing it all the time. It's just a question of how do you do it in your reports. And since I've done that course in 2020, all my reports have done this way, except when it's very specifically asked not to do that way. There are conditions where like it's a bit of an overkill to like give all your uncertainties and everything.
Thanks, everyone. Cole's email is down there, so if you want to send him a question, you're welcome. And Cole, I just want to thank you again for taking the time. I know you are very busy at the moment, so thanks for taking the time to
My
present
pleasure.
on this. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks, everyone. I think Teresa will send or circulate an email with a link to the recording afterwards. So I think we can just leave the meeting and hope that that all works out fine at the end. Thanks for joining this morning.